Hi everyone, my name is Fiza Sayed and I'm part of the honors cohort for this class. My honors project is based on religious perspectives on sexuality, and the reason I chose this topic is because personally religion has played a really big hand and has really influenced how I perceive sexuality. And so I was really curious to know how practitioners of other religions perceive sexuality. And so for that purpose, I conducted 3 interviews where I talked with practitioners from different religions asking their views on sexuality. We focused on 3 main aspects, which is what their religion teaches them about sexuality, what they were taught about sexuality growing up, either from their parents or a parental figure, and their current views on sexuality and what shaped them. And my aim is to highlight the generational difference of opinions towards sexuality along with the religious perspective. And so my first interviewee was a Catholic. She is of Chinese descent and she was born and raised in Indonesia. She has always identified as a Catholic, and growing up she attended church a lot. And her church taught her that every person, including their sexuality, is made in the image of God and thus has immense dignity. She describes sexuality as not just a biological sort of trait, rather it concerns the person's intimate soul, and therefore sexual intercourse has a procreative purpose. And her church was not in support of the LGBTQ plus community. So this is sort of what she learned from her church. In terms of her parental figures, her parents taught her sort of similar things to what the church told her, and that was sex is a very sort of holy exchange between a man and a woman, to refrain from having sex before marriage. And her parents never really talked to her about gender or sexuality as a spectrum. Rather, they were just accepting of the whole idea, but they didn't want any of their children to necessarily be part of the community, if that makes sense. Personally, for her, she learned about sort of sexuality as she moved to the US, and sort of self-educated herself. She does not agree with a lot of her parents' ideals and perspectives on sexuality. She mentioned that because there is a really big sort of generational gap between her and her parents, the way her parents view sexuality is more conservative, whereas she has more open-minded views. So she does not believe in waiting until marriage to have sex. Her parents also do not really encourage dating or relationships. She's against that as well, and she's definitely more open and accepting, and in support of the LGBTQ plus community. Moving on to my second interviewee, who was a Muslim. She's from Pakistan and was born and raised in Dubai. Growing up, she learned that sex is a gift, and it is to be strictly kept within marriage between a man and a woman. Her religion teaches her that adultery is regarded as a very serious crime, but she mentioned the fact that Islam lacks a central governing organization, so it's really hard to establish clear policies surrounding LGBTQ plus concerns. And so a lot of Islamic perspectives towards the LGBTQ plus community depend on ethnicity, generation, family upbringing, and cultural influences, because like I mentioned that, she grew up in Dubai, and her parents are from Pakistan, so they were part of a very conservative society, and so their views and their ideals are also more conservative. And so what her parents taught her were also very conservative sort of ideals, which was, like I mentioned, no dating, no sex before marriage, and definitely not very supportive of the LGBTQ plus community. However, she is a very devout Muslim, and so she really researched the religion on her own where she self-taught herself because she believes that what her parents were teaching her about the religion conflicted a lot with culture. And so what she was learning was more culture focused rather than religion focused. And her sort of findings were that Islam is a very accepting religion. And so she has learned to accept all people from, different sort of, whether they lie on whatever end they lie on the sexuality spectrum or wherever they fall in the LGBTQ plus community. She has learned to be accepting of all, and that's what she believes that Islam teaches. And so she also talked about how the geographical location and ethnicity and sort of family upbringing really has a very important sort of influence on someone's ideals, whether it was her parents or it was her. She believes that if she was raised in a very conservative, strict household, she would have those strict views as well because she wouldn't have exposure to the outside world. And so moving on to my last interviewee, who was a Buddhist. He is of Chinese descent and was born and brought up in Singapore. He claims that he did not really have access to a Buddhist education, so a lot that he learned was through self-teaching, through research, and he found that chastity is not a requirement of leading a Buddhist life. In fact, Buddhists are encouraged to enjoy sex responsibly. He also mentioned that there are several sects of Buddhism. The one he follows is Zen Buddhism, and that sect does not really make a distinction between same-sex and opposite-sex relationships, as long as you're not harming, exploiting, or manipulating a third party. In terms of family upbringing, he lived with his father his entire life, but they lived in a very sort of closed off, or like a very strict sort of relationship where his father wasn't very open with him, and so they never really had talks about gender and sexuality. So that is why he had to learn everything that he knows now through research, and that sort of formed his current views and his perspective on sexuality and gender as a whole. And he thinks that he's actually really grateful that he didn't have that experience of learning about sexuality from his parent, because that would sort of interfere with their culture. Like I mentioned earlier, he is of Chinese descent, and so being part of the LGBTQ plus community is looked down upon in their culture. And so because he did not really have exposure to that, he is glad that he did not perceive, or the fact that culture did not influence his current views on sexuality, and he was able to form his own. And so in conclusion, I would like to really hear from all of you watching what you all thought about sort of this experiment. And what I learned is that while religion plays a really big hand in forming a practitioner's opinion and views on sexuality, I personally feel like their ethnicity, their generation, their family upbringing, and cultural influences definitely shape a lot of their opinions.